Every July 4th weekend, thousands of people flock to Roswell, New Mexico to commemorate the anniversary of what they believe is the most important UFO event ever recorded. At the International UFO Museum and Research Center, believers pore over hundreds of controversial exhibits.
To believers, the Roswell incident is the mecca. It's the Rosetta Stone of all ufology and alien encounters.
Believers are persuaded not by any concrete evidence, but by the stories of eyewitnesses. People who claim to have seen a strange crash and alien bodies in the desert more than 50 years ago.
I would say the Roswell crash is the most significant event in human history. We had an encounter, albeit a very sad one, because the creatures were, with the possible exception of one, were dead. We had an encounter with creatures from another world.
But to skeptics, there are plenty of down-to-earth explanations for these fantastic stories.
The ufologists that really believe something alien happened at Roswell, they've taken just bits and pieces of events that did happen and distorted them and constructed around them a myth.
The events that come to be known as the Roswell incident begin in the early summer of 1947, a season which would change the town forever.
Flying saucer reports first started around June 25th of 1947, and almost immediately everyone began seeing flying saucers.
Residents of southeast New Mexico start to see strange things in the sky, things they call unidentified flying objects known as UFOs. New Mexico is abuzz with UFO mania and talk of invading Martians.
Please contact us. Please contact us. We are your friends.
Then, on July 5th, 1947, something really does fall from the skies near Roswell, landing on a field owned by sheep rancher Mac Brazel.
He thought he had the debris of a flying saucer, and so on Monday, July 7th, he went into the closest town to report his discovery.
Brazel contacts Sheriff Wilcox at Roswell, claiming he has found a flying saucer. The sheriff then calls the closest military base, Roswell Army Airfield, located just outside of town. Roswell Army Airfield is home to the 509th Bombardment Wing, at the time the only atomic strike force in the world. The Army Air Force reacts quickly, sending 2 officers the same day to investigate the site. They check out the crash area and bring the debris to the base. At noon the next day, Walter Haut, a public information officer at the base, issues a press release announcing the retrieval of a flying saucer. To this day, the mystery remains exactly why Haut issues this sensational release, but its effect is immediate.
Well, when Walter's story went out, it was a bombshell. All of a sudden, the whole world was hearing this business about, a flying saucer having been retrieved on somebody's sheep ranch.
Phone calls jammed the base switchboard. 4 hours later, Colonel Blanchard, commander of the 8th Air Force, takes steps to contain the frenzy. Furious with the commotion, he orders a retraction of the press release. The debris is flown to Fort Worth Army Airfield in Texas on orders from the government in Washington. Here, they have chosen the commander of the base, high-ranking Brigadier General Roger Ramey, as the best person to defuse the growing hysteria. inspects the wreckage and declares at a press conference on July 8th that it's nothing more than the remnants of a weather balloon. The bits of wood and plastic are then crated up and flown to Wright Field Army Air Base in Dayton, Ohio. After this press conference, the public loses interest in the Roswell UFO story. No eyewitnesses have come forward claiming to have seen aliens or a crashed flying disc. The story fades from memory.
We have to remember that the Roswell incident was not an incident in 1947. I mean, after those initial reports, the whole thing just died.
For almost 30 years, stories about a crashed alien spacecraft at Roswell would lie dormant, only to surface again later with renewed force. When we continue, how the government admits to lying about the real story behind the crash near Roswell in 1947.
It was a research effort. It had a very high priority, but the existence of the program was highly classified.
In 1980, a book written by Charles Berlitz and William Moore called The Roswell Incident revives interest in the story about a crashed flying saucer in Roswell in 1947. Berlitz is convinced that there must be something more behind the tale of crashed wreckage that was so quickly dismissed by the Air Force as a simple weather balloon. The book contains interviews with witnesses who have come forward claiming to see incredible things at the crash site. Now, eyewitnesses claim the government really did retrieve a flying saucer and alien bodies at Roswell and has lied about it ever since. The alleged cover-up kicks off as soon as sheep rancher Mac Brazel reports finding the debris.
And the Army was out there probably before daybreak the next morning, Saturday morning, picking the pieces up, and the story went forward from there. More accurately, the lack of story went forward from there because, of course, there was an immediate and thorough cover-up.
Witnesses now describe the crash site as teeming with armed military police who comb over piles of wreckage. These people say it's clearly recognizable as a flying saucer and injured aliens.
In the more extravagant descriptions of this event, even President Truman arrives at the impact site. There are still a few surviving aliens, and there's translators trying to dissect what they're saying.
According to these stories, the alien bodies and parts of the flying saucer are transported to a hangar at the Roswell Air Base.
And that place, it's kind of a creepy feeling even today to go by that building and look in there and think, you know, this is where the stuff was brought.
The bodies and debris are then shipped on to their final destination.
The bodies, probably all of them, eventually ended up, perhaps by way of Washington, you know, going out to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
Conspiracy theorists believe the aliens and wreckage reside somewhere in a heavily guarded, top-secret government installation. Since the first book about Roswell in 1980, many more witnesses have come forward and more books written, fueling the angry claims that the government is hiding something of momentous importance. But the government sticks to its 1947 original story of a weather balloon. In 1994, Congressman Stephen Schiff of New Mexico responds to pressure from his constituents by lobbying the General Accounting Office in Washington to fully investigate the matter. Then, in 1995, in a document called the Roswell Report, the Air Force finally claims to tell the truth, that the weather balloon explanation was indeed a cover story. This report reveals that the debris found by sheep rancher Mac Brazel came from a top-secret U.S. military program. Given the code name of Mogul, the military was testing special devices attached to high-altitude balloons as a way to spy on the Soviet Union.
After we used nuclear weapons to end World War II, the American military became very concerned that such weapons could be used against us. And in view of the knowledge of the Soviet espionage, there was great concern in monitoring the development of the Soviet nuclear weapons. As a result, there was very great pressure to get some detection system going.
The base of operations for Project Mogul is 100 miles southwest of Roswell at Alamogordo Army Airfield. But the location has one drawback. Clear skies make it hard to conceal the balloon flights. As young scientists contracted by the Air Force, both Charles Moore and Duke Gildenberg are among the few present at the secret launches. The bizarre materials they use could easily mystify a civilian observer. For the first time, they acknowledged that there were in fact many secret balloon flights in New Mexico in the summer of 1947.
In that whole period, there was great excitement throughout the United States about flying saucers. I'm sure all balloons that were being put up at that time were similarly being reported.
The balloons in this never-before-released Air Force footage create an optical illusion, appearing like shiny silver jellyfish in the sky. Project Mogul will send aloft a highly classified device ringed with sensitive microphones attached to a 600-foot-long string of helium balloons. This top-secret payload can acoustically detect atomic explosions, even from the other side of the world. The Air Materiel Command, or AMC, headquartered at Wright Field, Ohio, coordinates the project.
It was a research effort. It had a very high priority, but the existence of the program was highly classified.
It looked like maybe a hard plaster, which turned out, incidentally, to be the plexiglass cover for the classified Mogul payload, but it had broken on impact.
Pretty soon, this mutates into this unusual material that you ball up and it pops back out. Where did that come from? Well, in my opinion, that comes from up here. That comes from out of somebody's imagination and the retelling of the story from this original kite-like balloon material, which doesn't sound very alien to this other stuff, which sounds really alien.
In the Roswell report, the Air Force admits there are grains of truth to some of the news stories. Specifically, eyewitness claims that the wreckage is adorned with some kind of alien hieroglyphic writing in pink or purple. The Mogul target device does in fact have a similar appearance.
It was put together with some tape that had some flower-like, abstract flower-like designs that were pinkish purple in color. Every time I prepared a target for flight, I always puzzled what was the function of those flower-like designs.
It turns out that the company that made the targets used the decorated tape simply because it was on hand. Over time, the story surrounding the visit by Major Jesse Marcel and Captain Sheridan Cavett to the crash site is also dramatically enhanced.
The devil was in the details, and all the details were wrong. For instance, they described Cavett as driving a carryall. No, He never drove the carryall. They said Marcel used a Geiger counter. Nobody out there had a Geiger counter. They said they returned with a convoy of MPs. Cabot said they never picked up any MPs. None of it ever happened. And this is just the nitty-gritty details.
When you really look into them in the Roswell incident, they're almost never really eyewitnesses. They're usually somebody who knew somebody. In my opinion, that's what virtually all of these eyewitness accounts are, nothing more than these sort of misleading, misremembered, filled-in-the-blank, false memories type eyewitness accounts.
But the Air Force's Roswell report doesn't end the controversy. The Air Force would have to issue another document to explain why some people believed they saw aliens near Roswell in 1947. When we continue, how the recovery of crash dummies produced strange sightings around Roswell.
We would send over the helicopter and recovery crews with a number of body bags and pack them in the body bags.
In 1995, the U.S. Air Force tried to put an end to the mysteries of the alleged 1947 Roswell UFO crash with its official study, the Roswell Report. This explains how a top-secret reconnaissance balloon project most likely accounts for descriptions of the unusual materials found on a remote New Mexico ranch. But this report does not make any attempt to explain why many witnesses quoted by UFO researchers believe they saw aliens. Although their descriptions of the aliens vary in details, they do share many characteristics.
We're generally looking at creatures of a very, very short stature, no more than probably 3.5 feet. The four-fingered hand seems to be pretty much a point of agreement.
Additionally, witnesses describe the bodies as having no hair, no eyelashes or eyebrows, and no visible ears.
The heads tend to be described as pear-shaped with somewhat larger than usual eyes, with other orifices not very well marked. Not much of a mouth, not much for ears or nose.
Witnesses compare the alien bodies to dummies or dolls with expressionless, serene looks on their faces. They are dressed in something like a one-piece jumpsuit. To dispel the myth that the government retrieved aliens at the Roswell crash site, the Air Force issues a second document called the Roswell Report, Case Closed, in 1997. This details another secret program, Project High Dive, conducted by the Air Force between 1954 and 1959. High Dive tests a revolutionary parachute that will operate at extremely high altitudes. Too dangerous for humans, the first chutes are tested on anthropomorphic dummies.
We had anthropomorphic dummies that we instrumented, and we could send these dummies to high altitude on single balloons, and with a command signal could separate the balloon from the dummy and let it free fall and open a parachute at some altitude just to see what data we could gather.
The balloons carrying the dummies are launched from the desert near Holloman Air Force Base in southeast New Mexico. Although none are launched from Roswell, many dummies land and are recovered close to Roswell.
We would send over the helicopter and recovery crews with a number of body bags and pack them in the body bags as soon as we got there.
The dummies are dressed in standard Air Force one-piece flight suits. The sight of them could easily alarm the uninitiated onlooker.
But they also described the dummies in details, like saying they had no hair, no ears. The mouth did not seem to serve as an opening for conversation or digestion, and on and on and on.
One witness described an alien body as cold to the touch. This is entirely appropriate since the dummies plunge from the stratosphere, where they have been subjected to sub-zero temperatures. On impact, they are still freezing, even as they lie on the desert floor. The recovery crews also use an ambulance converted into a communications vehicle and a type of 4x4 truck known as a weapons carrier. These same vehicles are frequently mentioned by witnesses as being present at the alien recovery site. But conspiracy theorists are not at all convinced that crash dummies explain alien sightings around Roswell.
First of all, the crash dummies are around 6 feet tall. And compared to these little guys we're talking about, these little 3.5 foot lithe, thin, very, very small figures, I really can't see how anybody could make that mistake.
Also, the dummy experiments began 7 years after the alleged Roswell crash. However, the Air Force believes the many similarities between the descriptions cannot be denied. But even those who support the Air Force's explanations are not entirely convinced.
I think it's just the Air Force's attempt to provide some meat here to the story to explain it. What else could these aliens be? For most skeptics, they're entirely up here. Either they're making it up, or they're just fantasy-prone personalities. They think they saw something. Did they see crash dummies? Maybe.
The dummies used in Project High Dive cannot explain one important story about an alien encounter. A sighting held by conspiracy theorists to be the single most convincing proof that aliens did land in Roswell. When we continue, how a pilot becomes grotesquely disfigured and mistaken for an alien.
And by now, my eyes had completely swollen shut and had turned black.
The star witness for Roswell conspiracy theorists is Glenn Dennis. In 1947, Dennis is a mortician at the Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell. He claims that on July 6th, he drives an injured airman to the hospital at Walker Air Force Base, just outside Roswell.
When I arrived there, where I usually park the ambulance, there were 3 old field ambulances, and they had these 2 old swinging doors, and one of them was open maybe 12 or 14 inches or so, and I saw a lot of debris in the back of it.
The debris is unusual and unlike anything he has ever seen before.
It looked more like maybe what fiberglass would look like today. It was very thin. There was a piece that kind of looked like the end of a canoe. It was coming up like this. But what really got my attention was it looked like it had some hieroglyphics.
Dennis then enters the hospital and encounters a nurse named Naomi Maria Self, who is highly agitated. She tells him to leave immediately.
He was in the process of leaving, and these people accosted him and said, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Well, I came out here on business, And they said, "Well, you're not supposed to be here." And in fact, he ended up being dealt out that famous threat, if you don't get out of here and you don't keep quiet, they're going to be picking your bones out of the sand.
Dennis says this vicious threat was delivered by an angry, red-headed captain. Dennis leaves, but returns the next day to meet with the nurse. She then tells him of an incredible alien autopsy conducted by 2 doctors in the hospital the day before.
She said, "You won't believe this." She said they had done these crash bags that were laying on this iron gurney. There was 2 very mutilated, she said, very, very small bodies. Some of them looked like they were almost black.
The nurse tells Dennis their odor is so overpowering that she and the doctors are forced to abandon the autopsy. After his conversation with the nurse, Dennis would never see her again.
She was shipped out that afternoon after 3 o'clock. One of the nurse officers that I knew called me and said that your friend had just been transferred out.
The Air Force argues that Dennis's amazing story, which has passed firmly into popular legend, may be nothing more than a confused mix of details from two separate Air Force accidents that occurred near Roswell. The first accident occurs in 1956. An Air Force aircraft crashes into the desert outside Roswell. 11 crew members perish. The crash site is surrounded by MPs to keep the public away from the grisly scene. The black, mangled bodies of the crew are taken for autopsy to Walker Air Force Base. Due to the overpowering smell of burnt flesh and fuel, the autopsy is stopped and the bodies sealed in body bags. The bags are then sent to the Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell, where proper refrigeration is available. Dennis, an employee of the funeral home, may have seen the bodies here, placed in cold storage. The Air Force believes that Dennis's memory of the event may have evolved into this tale of an alien autopsy.
In psychology, we call this confabulation, where you're mixing real memories with your own interpretations of them, with fantasies that you've added to it, with other people's accounts of what they think they saw, and all that becomes a genuine memory for you, but it doesn't really exist anywhere else other than this one person's mind. Then that becomes the star eyewitness account in this Roswell incident, when in fact it doesn't really represent anything at all.
As for the nurse, government records show there was never anyone named Naomi Maria Self stationed at Walker Air Force Base, and no one by that name ever served in the Air Force. Other details of Dennis's experience at the hospital can be explained by an Air Force balloon accident. It is related here for the first time on camera by an Air Force officer involved in the accident.
Here is the genesis of the observations by the off-base non-Air Force people that aliens were seen being taken into the hospital at Roswell.
Since 1954, the Air Force has been testing a special high-altitude parachute with anthropomorphic dummies. However, research gained from these dummies was inconclusive.
We reached a point, I would say beginning in about 1958, that we needed now to start looking at actual human subjects rather than just dummies.
This new endeavor, codenamed Project Excelsior, is a risky undertaking. Captain Joe Kittinger, a fearless, red-headed test pilot, volunteers to jump from an open gondola from the edge of space at 100,000 feet to test the parachute. The training for this dangerous project operates under strict secrecy. Two other pilots, Captain Dan Fulgham and Captain Bill Kaufman, also prepare for the perilous mission. The three intrepid pilots ascend in a special gondola on May 21st, 1959, on a simple, low-level training flight. But the landing outside Roswell doesn't go according to plan.
And the gondola dropped to the ground. The lateral speed was such that it tin-canned it. It just turned it end over end over end. But as it came to rest upside down. I was lying on the ground. And the lip of the gondola trapped my head between the gondola and the ground.
Fulgham's head immediately swells. The recovery helicopter flies him and Kittinger, who has minor injuries, to the hospital at Walker Air Force Base. The balloon unit's recovery crew, driving their communications vehicle, a converted ambulance, picks up Kaufman in the balloon wreckage and drives over to the base.
We finally got in, and I think one of the MPs drove us down to the hospital and guided us to the hospital. Once we got there, we parked by the emergency. There was a ramp right there.
The converted ambulance is parked exactly where Dennis claims to have seen an ambulance with bizarre wreckage inside. There are 2 panels similar to the ends of a canoe. There is also writing on them which could be difficult to decipher at a distance. Inside the hospital, Fulgham's head has swollen to twice its normal size. This remarkable photo was taken days after the swelling had already begun to subside.
The first thing the flight surgeon did, of course, to try and contain the swelling in my head was to wrap me in ace bandages. And of course, that further enhanced the bulk of the head. And by now, my eyes had completely swollen shut and had turned black from the blood.
Fulgham, free to roam the hospital, draws stares from startled onlookers. Meanwhile, Kittinger is desperately trying to arrange their return to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio to avoid any unnecessary publicity for this secret project.
Pro-alien Roswell writers talk about this red-headed captain, which was Joe Kittinger, talking to some of the people there and making even vicious threats toward them and even their families if they divulge what had happened. What the real story was that he had asked them very politely, please don't say anything about this balloon accident because I have forthcoming programs that could be compromised if too many people learned about this accident.
The near-fatal accident doesn't derail Project Excelsior. Kittinger, Kaufman, and Fulgham continue their balloon-borne exploration of the upper atmosphere. With the dawn of the space age, New Mexico will see more exotic Air Force experimentation in the 1960s and 70s. Experiments that will continue to fuel stories of UFOs in Roswell. When we return, how experiments with space probes triggered reports of UFOs.
We launched the Viking nose cone with hot rockets on board from Roswell itself.
Since the alleged crash at Roswell in 1947, residents of New Mexico have described silver discs zipping through the air. Between 1966 and 1972, the balloon unit at Holloman Air Force Base conducts experiments near Roswell with vehicles which actually are spacecraft. But they aren't extraterrestrial. They're space probes for NASA's Viking, Surveyor, and Voyager programs, seen here in this newly collected footage.
We flew a number of disc-shaped objects, and those were seen in the air sometimes as flying saucers. We launched the Viking nose cone with hot rockets on board from Roswell itself. Several of the museums in Roswell, they made copies of the Viking nose cone and said, hey, this is what their spaceship looked like.
The space probes are flown to 100,000 feet from a balloon and then released for self-propelled supersonic free flight back to the desert floor. To an imaginative observer, tests of these NASA space probes could easily be confused with a visitation from another world. The probes, stored on base in hangars, may have spurred tales of a captured flying saucer.
And they kept things kind of locked up so people wouldn't get in there and poke around. But people passing by, maybe through a crack in a hangar door, would occasionally see this thing. And what it was interpreted as was a leftover from the 1947 crash.
These giant tethered balloons used for weather experiments also add to the stories of strange objects hovering over the Southwest. This rig, called a V-balloon, first flew in the 1960s and bears a remarkable resemblance to an eyewitness drawing of the UFO that allegedly crashed in Roswell in 1947. These are only the highlights of the Air Force's answer to questions about an alien encounter at Roswell more than 50 years ago. The two official reports try to illuminate the mysteries that have grown up around a highly sensitive Cold War balloon project and other experiments conducted in the remote New Mexico desert. Conspiracy theorists totally reject their arguments.
It's funny how they just kind of switch from one story to another and say, oh, well, don't think about the fact that we were lying the first time, And then, of course, later it was the crash dummies story. I really just wish they would learn to say no comment. That really, I think, dignifies the whole scenario more than anything else could.
Disbelievers draw different conclusions to the Roswell myth.
If I may make a parallel to the JFK assassination, the Roswell incident has all the makings of the same sort of conspiratorial thinking in that the case will never be closed in either of these things. And the reason is because the mystery is more compelling than the solution.
But die-hard believers refuse to give up the idea that the government covered up an alien UFO crash at Roswell. They still hope that one day this so-called cover-up will finally be exposed.
I wish we had a piece of debris. We don't. I wish we had a photograph of the crash site before the retrieval. We don't. I wish we had a photograph of the bodies. I wish we had the bodies, but we don't have any of these things. What we have is many hundreds of witnesses.
Some believe the continued spinning of the Roswell myth is nothing more than a way to make a buck.
And then it expands into a media feeding frenzy. And that's the bottom line. The bottom line is the green bottom line, period.
It's put Roswell on the map for one thing. We're averaging over 200,000 people a year that are coming. 86% of the people come to Roswell come to see this museum. Now that isn't a lot of people,
But people still remain firmly divided over the truth about the Roswell incident, which has nevertheless earned its place in history.
If we looked back in 100 years from now, and let's say some social historian decides to write a history of the second half of 20th century America and some of the unusual things that people believed, I think Roswell will be up in the top 10 of the myths of America in the Cold War as a classic example of a mass hysteria and sort of an urban legend that gets told of the fears and anxieties that Americans had during the Cold War, wrapped around all this new and exciting NASA science fiction culture that we live